Hey, good morning. This is Senator Craig Brandt with the Roundhouse Rundown, and we're going to take a little bit of an exit from what we normally talk about. And we're going to go back to talking a little bit about Israel and what's happening there. And as you know, on the first anniversary of October 7th massacre, I made a podcast dedicated to what happened on that day. I then, decided that a lot of us don't really understand the history of Israel and the history of the Jewish people, and so we really wanted to go a little bit more into that history, and so my new assistant Lisa found a really a great guest for us who is more of an authority than I am for sure. And so we're bringing in a journalist and academic expert on the subject to help dispel some of the common misperceptions. So Claire Berlinski is a distinguished journalist, academic, and author. She brings a wealth of experience to the topic of Israel's history. Born in California in 1968 and raised in New York, Seattle, and California, she pursued her undergraduate degree in modern history at Balliol College, Oxford, and later earned a doctorate in international relations, specializing in U.S. foreign policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. Her professional journal brings expertise to the situation evolving in the Middle East today, especially regarding Israel. Welcome, Claire, and thank you for joining us on your from Paris today.
Thank you so much, and hello, New Mexico.
Well, we're really glad that you were able to come on, and I was sharing with Claire earlier that we were both born in California the same exact year, so we have a little bit of background together.
What month?
18 years. I was born in August, so you're just a hair older than me.
Yeah.
But and I actually spent my full first 18 years in California, and then I've spent very little time there since. Gone back to visit family, but that's about it.
Wasn't it beautiful back then?
Yes, it was. It was a wonderful place to have grown up back then. It's just really not a place I like to be anymore.
Yes, that's what I hear from everyone. That's
Yeah.
really sad. It's incredibly sad.
Even most of my family that lives there wants to get out. So
Really?
yeah,
Really? Same complaints everyone has, the
pretty much.
filth and the crime and the
Yep, filth, crime, the cost of living there is so high. So, but, well, Clara, I know that there are a lot of misconceptions about how the Jewish people came to be in what we call Israel, that they colonized the area and that they are mainly white Europeans and the like. Can you take us through the history of the Jewish people up to the formation of the state of Israel in 1948, going back as far as you think is necessary to dispel some of these myths?
I sure can. First thing I'm going to say is I am the editor of a publication on Substack. It's called The Cosmopolitan Globalist, which is just what it sounds like. We treat foreign news that we think the mainstream media is neglecting, and that's most of the foreign news these days. And after October 7th, I was, of course, profoundly shaken up by it. And when the protests against Israel began, even before there had been a moment's thought in Israel about how to retaliate, I was pretty horrified. And I was especially horrified because it seemed to me that what people were saying had nothing to do with the real Israel, the real history of the region. And the ignorance was just palpable. I could just feel it. I could feel that people were talking about a fantasy world. They were talking about something they were imagining. And no one was telling them, no, wait, that's not correct. And I realized that it was really eating at me. I realized that I could either let this eat at me or I could do something constructive. And so I thought, I can't make everyone in the world smarter, but I have a lot of subscribers, and perhaps I could just teach a little class like I used to. I used to teach at Santa Clara University, the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so I asked my readers, would there be any interest in studying a history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, something that'll help you to make sense of the news, of the headlines that you're seeing? And the response was overwhelming.
Wow.
So and I was really surprised by that. I thought maybe, one or two people might be slightly interested, but my readers were really interested. And what that told me was that a lot of people feel I should know more about this history. I might have strong feelings about it, but I don't really know how all of this happened. I'm confused. I keep hearing the same things, the 1967 war or the Nakba, or things like that, and I don't really know what they were. So let me start by saying that I can give you a little overview here, but it's no substitute for actually studying the history. And you don't need to become a PhD to have a pretty good sense of what happened. But if you commit to reading a book a week, in about 12 weeks, I'd say, you can have a pretty good general overview of how all this happened. And
so if you're a little slower of a reader like me, you might do that a book a month. But
yeah, well, it's a good habit to get into.
Anyway, you'd still learn it, and that's really interesting. I'm looking forward to actually signing up and taking that class. I think it'd be great.
Yeah, and we have reading lists on the tab that's called Middle East 101. You can follow the class from the very beginning. Now, I'm not going to take you all the way back to the ancient times in the land of Israel, and we're not going to go through the biblical account, even though this is important to the way Jews think of it. Right. I want to take you back to the Ottoman Empire, to the age of empires. Well, this is something that people need. I don't think people understand this clearly. I think many people think there was something called a state of Palestine before the foundation of the state of Israel. There was not. What there was the Ottoman Empire, which dissolved in the wake of the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. And the Ottoman Empire was vast. It was vast, and it was legitimate in the eyes of Muslims. It was the caliphate. But there were also a lot of nationalist stirrings. There were Arabs who wanted to have the autonomy and to be in charge of their own affairs. Now, in the late 19th century, we see a rise of nationalist movements everywhere. And what is a nationalist movement? Do you have a sense of that, Senator, what a nationalist movement is?
I think, just wanting to have a country you belong to.
Wanting to have a country. When we talk about a nation state, we talk about a people who have something important in common: a language, a shared history, a shared sense of being the same people for whatever reason, whether it's true or not. It's people who think we belong together and we want self-determination. That's what nationalism is. We want to be in charge of our own affairs. We want to be, when we look at the people we elect, we want them to be people like us. Right. And nationalism swept the Ottoman Empire, mostly in the north and mostly in the Balkans. And the Ottoman Empire was losing parts of it was losing parts of Greece, what is now modern day Greece, and it was losing other territories, and it was falling apart. The Ottoman Empire was falling apart. They called it the stick man of Europe. And it's in its final days, it made the fatal error of throwing in with the Central Powers, with Germany, in the First World War. And it was defeated, of course, by the Allies. When it was defeated, its territories were partitioned. And the territory that people now refer to as Palestine was put under a mandate, as was the other territories like Iraq and what we now call Iraq, what we now call Syria. It was put under a British mandate, and the British were supposed to take this territory and help it achieve self-government, sort of like to be a tutor in self-government, because this was an area that had not governed itself ever before. Well, not ever, but hundreds of years. Before the Ottomans, there were the Mongols before them. So there was a sense that it had to be educated for self-governance. Now, at roughly this time, you have a Jewish nationalist movement. What does that mean? The founder of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl, was seized by the idea that even though in the late 19th century, Jews were more emancipated, more liberated in Europe, and more successful than they had ever been before. This was an age where people thought they were very enlightened, and France, for example, had emancipated all of its Jews, and Jews were in principle equal under the law. It was also the time of the Dreyfus Affair. Does that ring a bell? That name, Dreyfus?
I know the name, but I can't remember what it is.
He was a French army officer who was framed for a crime, for treason, for a crime he didn't commit.
Hmm.
And his trial, he was Jewish, and his trial gave rise to an anti-Semitic outpouring throughout France. And it should be remembered that it also gave rise to the opposite, people who defended him. There were the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. And Émile Zola, whose famous letter, J'accuse, I accuse, accused the French state of a heinous anti-Semitic crime. Ultimately, he was exonerated, but it was a very black stain on the epoch, and it's one of the things that gave Theodor Herzl a premonition. That and the rise of populist nationalist parties in Austria, where he lived. Now, Herzl was quite assimilated. He was only barely a practicing Jew. I don't even think he was a practicing Jew. I think one of his first ideas for solution to what he called the Jewish question was perhaps Jews should just all convert, which was something that many Jews had done over the course of the years, right? But he ultimately felt he was looking at a continent that simply could never accept Jews, where Jews would always be insecure. And this was a remarkable premonition at the time, because it seemed as if everything was going the opposite direction. And he had a vision of a Jewish state. Now, as far as he was concerned, it didn't have to be the land of Israel. It's true, Jews had a deep emotional connection to the land of Israel, but he was willing to consider other places. He was willing to consider Uganda. But Herzl single-handedly really got the project of Zionism, having Jews achieve self-determination in their own homeland. He single-handedly turned that into a mass movement. There had been people who had said things like that before. He was not the first to say it, but he had a charismatic personality, and he was able to persuade a large number of Jews that self-determination was the only way that Jews would ever be secure, would ever realize their fullest potential. And he had a very utopian vision of what this Jewish state would be like. It would be living in peace. It would be a model to all of its neighbors. It would be technologically advanced. He got that right.
Yes.
So you have this movement, which is very, very powerful, gaining in influence throughout Europe, and Jews coming to this part of the Ottoman Empire and buying property. It's simply a myth that Jews came and stole the land. They mostly bought it all. They bought it, and often bought it at very exorbitant prices. There was a direct connection between the amount of oppression that Jews experienced in Europe and the number of people who tried to go to Palestine, or what was then called the Palestine part of the Ottoman Empire. And there were some vicious pogroms at the time in Russia and in the Pale of Settlement, and this created more motion in this direction. Now, what was the status of the people who were living there? Were they Palestinians per se? No, they were citizens of the Ottoman Empire, which means that probably some people had a consciousness of being from that region specifically, but at that time, you would not have found someone who said, I am a Palestinian. They would have said, I am a citizen of the Ottoman Empire, and I live next to this city, next to Jaffa or next to Jerusalem. There was certainly a sense that Jerusalem was a holy city for Muslims. That's absolutely true. But there was no distinct Palestinian national consciousness until a lot of Jews showed up. And then Palestinians began to feel threatened by the influx and began to be worried that they were going to be under a Jewish government when the British left. They began to worry that the Jews were going to take the place over, and began violently rebelling against this.
Right. There
was a massive uprising in 1936. Excuse me if I look distracted, this is why. There was a massive uprising in 1936, and the crisis began to come to a head. The British, who had promised this land, this is an interesting part of it, I don't want to get too far into this, but the British made simultaneous promises they promised the Jews that they would look favorably upon a Jewish homeland. They used the word homeland. They didn't specify what this was. Was it a state? Was it just that they would allow Jews to immigrate there? And they also promised the Arabs self-determination. Have you watched Lawrence of Arabia?
Yes.
Okay, so you know that story of the way the British exploited Arab nationalist sentiment to persuade them to rebel against the Turks, to serve their own imperial interests, and then betrayed them. Right? So the empire is a rough business.
They did the same thing with the Jewish people.
Yeah, well, you could either say that they betrayed them both, or you could say they tried their best to be fair and to make everyone happy. It was pretty obvious toward the end of this period that these two peoples were not going to live together happily in the same political entity. Mm-hmm. And there were various proposals for separating them into their own states, which were rejected by the Arabs.
Right.
How quickly do I want to go over this history? Because it's super interesting, but I know we don't have that much time today. So I think we're going to go right to 1948, the War of Independence. At this point, immigration, the British had banned further immigration to the region by Jews because the Arabs were so unhappy about it. And the toll of the Holocaust was vastly higher because of that, because there was no escape, because there was no way for Jews to get to Palestine. Mm-hmm. And at this point, the Jews were basically at war with the British, right? At this point, the British, after suffering, just being unable to keep control of it, said, okay, we're turning this over to the United Nations. We don't want this anymore. Our mandate for Palestine, it's done. They turned it over to the United Nations, and the United Nations took a look at this and did a lot of complicated thinking and studies and so forth, and came up with a partition plan in which the Jews would have had a very small state, much smaller than the one they now have. I could pull up some maps of this now, but I can show you those after I finish the story. And the Jews said, yes, we'll take it. You know, we're not in a position to be picky. We need a state of our own, and it doesn't matter how small it is, we will take it. The Arabs said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We will not have a Jewish state in the heart of the Islamic world. There was a sense among the Arabs that they were finally being liberated after years and years of colonialism. Not just British colonialism, but Turkish colonialism, before that Mongol colonialism. And they were damned if these interlopers were going to be setting up a state right around their holy lands. But here's something that is very important to remember. Jews did have a continuous presence in this region, going all the way back to ancient times. It wasn't always a very big presence, but there was a continuous presence. And when the Ottoman Empire dissolved, it dissolved into basically artificial states, the artificial state of Iraq, the basically artificial state of Syria. Mm-hmm. Jews, if they had been treated as normal citizens of the Ottoman Empire, would probably have been given their own state. Right? Because they were citizens of the Ottoman Empire. Another thing to keep in mind is that as the Jewish presence in this region grew, the Jews brought with them a lot of industry, a lot of money, and therefore created a lot of jobs. And so other citizens of the Ottoman Empire were also moving to this region that is now the state of Israel. So while it's absolutely true that there are some families that go back, you could say, my family has been in Palestine for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's not as many as people think. There was a lot of internal migration in the Ottoman Empire. And you can actually, it's interesting, you can see that now. If you look at Palestinians, just as you'll see if you go to Istanbul, which is the seat of the Ottoman Empire, you'll see that there's not one facial type. You'll see blonde Palestinians, and you'll see blue-eyed Palestinians, you'll see dark-haired Palestinians, and you'll be thinking, that's not what you would expect if they had all been living there together for as far back as time.
Right.
So you see that this was part of a polyglot, part of a very cosmopolitan empire, with lots and lots of ethnicities, Christian Palestinians, different kinds of Christian Palestinians, Muslim Palestinians, and at this point, they called themselves Arabs, right? They didn't call themselves Palestinians, they called themselves Arabs. And when Israel declared independence, all of its neighbors immediately declared war on Israel. So you had Egypt, you had Jordan, you had Lebanon, Syria, all trying to destroy the nascent Jewish state. Mm-hmm. They failed. They didn't. But the story of the 1948 war is really extraordinary. And you will almost certainly hear that the war was brutal and that there were massacres if you talk to people casually about it. And that is true. There were massacres. Palestinians were massacred, but so were Jews. It was a brutal, brutal war. This doesn't excuse a massacre, but it's a common myth that it was only Jews doing the massacring. There were massacres on both sides. The Jews, now they were Israelis, lost 1% of their population in this war. And in the end, they had a state that was slightly bigger than the one the United Nations had apportioned them. At this point, you still don't have anything that's a Palestine. You still don't have a Palestinian consciousness. You have some Palestinian consciousness. That's not quite right, but you don't have a group of people saying, we are Palestinians and we want self-determination for the Palestinian people. You have people who are displaced from the war, Arabs who have been displaced from the war, and who are now in refugee camps, who are now spread out throughout the region, who sincerely believe that the Arabs are just going to regroup and then get rid of these interlopers, and that'll be that, and we're going to go home. And then you have an organization that was founded to deal with the Palestinians, deal with the refugees from this conflict, which we still have today, called UNRWA, mm-hmm. the UN Reliefs and Works Agency, which there is a UN refugee organization and there is UNRWA. There's two organizations that deal with refugees in the world. And UNRWA was, I'm not going to get too far into that, but let's just say that Palestinian refugees were treated rather differently from refugees from other conflicts. Mm-hmm.
Is it true? So with the UN partition plan, mm-hmm. the UN came in and they set up a plan that would give the Jewish people a section and mm-hmm. the Palestinians their own section, mm-hmm. and that's the part that all the Palestinians and all the Arab countries said no, they would not accept it.
They rejected it. They rejected
it. And I think they thought that since they had been together for a while, that the Jewish people just being formed would not have been able to stand up to them. In fact, I think it was a miracle that they were able to survive, let alone win.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. It shouldn't be underestimated that this is taking place right after the Second World War and Hitler, and the Palestinian religious figure who was most prominent at this time, Haj Amin al-Husseini, spent the war by Hitler's side. Right, he was profoundly influenced by the Nazis, and the idea that these people who the Nazis had been telling him were the lowest people in the world had come in and created a state. We're trying to create a state where the Arabs were supposed to be. This was it was intolerable, just intolerable as far as he was concerned, as far as many people who were listening to him were concerned. There were, then as now, there were more moderate voices, but his was particularly powerful and charismatic. And this is where the tragedy begins. A conflict that could have ended there was never ended, has not ended to this day.
Right.
Because you have two competing nationalisms with two irreconcilable goals. For the Jews, it's to have their own state. For the Palestinians, it's the Jews not have a state. It's unfortunately, when we talk about the two-state solution now, there is an assumption that that's what Palestinians want. And I don't think there's a huge amount of evidence for that yet. I mean, there's some evidence. I don't want to exaggerate. I'd say 50 or 60% of Palestinians want it, but the rest don't. And that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem.
So
I'm jumping ahead to the present day.
No, that's okay. And so you have that war in 1948, where it wasn't really just that Israel declared their independence; they were given this land to be independent by the United Nations.
By the United Nations, that's right.
Right.
The United Nations declared them a member of the United Nations. And in this respect, the United States was absolutely critical. Truman decided, against the advice of many in the State Department and the cabinet, they said, this is going to create problems with the entire Arab world, whose oil we need. Why on earth would we do this? And Truman, I think the reason is because he was horrified by what we were learning about the Holocaust, and he felt that it was a morally important thing that the Jews have a place they could call home. And also, there were a lot of Jews in New York whose vote he wanted.
Yeah, probably, right.
No, for real.
Some talk at a point in actually creating a Israel state in the United States.
I'm sorry?
Was
in Alaska,
yeah. Yeah, I thought I read something about that, where they had talked about possibly making one of the areas of the United States would become the Israel state.
Yeah, there was serious talk about that, and there was serious talk about Uganda.
Okay.
And it's one of those moments where you can see a completely different history happening. If it was the Eastern European Jews who said, absolutely not. The only place we want to go is Israel. But Theodore Herzl was perfectly open to the idea of Uganda. He brought the idea to the Congress of Zionists and said, what do you think? And he was booed out of the room. They said, no, we haven't been waiting for thousands of years only to go to Uganda. We want to be in the land of Israel.
Right. They wanted to go back to really what was their homeland.
Yes, and
they're like the original people of that land.
They felt very much that they were the original people of that land. But it is reasonable to say, well, what if the Romans decided they want to go back and create the Roman Empire now? We wouldn't find that legitimate. But I think what people are overlooking when they talk about that is that there was no state of Italy.
Right.
There was an empire that was collapsing, and Jews legitimately lived there. They lived throughout the empire. Now, this is an important point. The Jews, between 1948 and about 1970, all of the Jews who lived in the former Ottoman Empire, and there were about 800,000 of them, as many as there were Palestinians who were expelled in the 1948 war, were expelled from the new nation states that were born. So there was a huge population transfer. Jews were expelled from Iraq. They were expelled from North Africa. They were expelled from Egypt. And they ended up, most of them, in Israel. So if you look at the Ottoman Empire as having broken up into its constituent parts, it actually is perfectly logical that there would be a Jewish state. It's perfectly logical.
Absolutely.
And most Israelis now, the majority, are descendants of the Jews from the Middle East, not from Europe. Okay. So there is an idea that the Jews were colonists. They were white European colonists, which is just not true. The Jews in Israel now are mostly from the Middle East. Not mostly, I would say more than half, maybe 60%. There's a lot of intermarriage. I don't know how much we actually know at this point, but there's a huge Middle Eastern population, the majority, and they were the colonized rather than the colonizers.
Right.
And they were the ones who were fighting the British, not on the side of the British. Mm-hmm. So this is all completely mixed up history, and understanding this can help people put a lot of what they're hearing in context, to understand that it's just not a conflict that maps one-to-one with American racial politics,
right,
or with what they think of, it doesn't map to Algeria as a conflict. I mean, people may know something about the way the Algerians got rid of the French, and they may be thinking, this is the same situation. It's not. It's very, very different.
So let's jump to 1967, because I think that was also another key time for Israel. And what happened in 1967? I've heard it called the 6-Day War. But
yeah, this is what people should understand, is that between 1948 and 67, there was a ceasefire, but there was no peace. And Israel was being attacked regularly by Arabs who called Fedayeen, who were making cross-border raids, who were committing massacres, and was responding also with great force. The Israelis gave as good as they got, but it was a low-level war, and which erupted into a hot war in 1956 in the Suez War. It's a very complex thing internationally, because the British and the French had very different goals from the Israelis, and Eisenhower put the kibosh on it. Eisenhower said, you keep this up and we're tanking the pound sterling to the British. He was furious. He was furious because it was taking international attention away from Hungary. And it was making it very, very difficult for the United States to present itself as the... I'm going to get too much into details here because we want to go to 67, but let's just say there was not a peaceful situation.
Right. I don't think we could actually look, as we look through the history of Israel from 1948 on, I don't think we can find a time where Israel's been at peace. I don't
there's been more or less.
There's
never been
some kind of attack, right? Either by terrorists or another country or groups that would come in and try to, which culminated in what we saw last year. But I think 1957 was one of those other key wars, in my opinion, at the earlier part of the start of of this.
1967 was an earthquake. It changed the entire Middle East. It was a surprise victory. I mean, not many wars are won in 6 days.
Right. I mean, it even took us 40 days in Desert Storm, right? And that was pretty amazing. That when I was in the military, I was in Desert Storm, and so that was pretty amazing. But for this to only take 6 days was, again, I'll use the term miraculous. I think it was really a miraculous thing.
Well, the feeling that it was miraculous has been an important aspect. It's been a driver of certain currents in Israeli politics. It's after this that you get a really messianic strain of thought in Israeli politics, and you see the rise of, I don't want to get too deep into Israeli domestic politics, but it is important. And suddenly Israel, went in the course of 6 days from a general feeling that they were about to be wiped out, the second Holocaust was imminent,
right,
to having destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, to having taken large parts of Egyptian territory all the way to the Sinai, and taken the West Bank, and what we call the West Bank, and unified Jerusalem. This was, whether you believe in miracles or not, this was certainly unusual. If you define a miracle as something that is highly, highly, highly unlikely to happen naturally, I think you can call it a miracle. Suddenly, Israel is in possession of a lot of territory that had belonged to its adversaries.
Right.
And the immediate thought was to trade the territory back for peace treaties, right? As at this point that Jordan relinquished its claim to the West Bank and said that's for the Palestinians, as the first time you get an idea that this should be a Palestinian state, right? Because until then it was in Jordanian hands.
Right.
Egypt at the time is a Soviet client. This war was hugely significant to the United States. Now, before the 1967 war, we didn't send weapons to Israel at all, apart from a few Phantoms under Johnson. We were not the source of Israel's
strength,
of Israel's military. They were equipped by the French, they were equipped by the Czechs, but we wanted to stay out of it on the grounds that we had a weapons embargo on the region. We were trying to get everyone to stop fighting.
Right.
And we didn't want any interruption of the oil, and we wanted to be focused on the Cold War. And all of this was a big distraction, and we were particularly worried that the issue of Israel was going to make it harder for us to maintain our strategic alliances in the region. So it's actually, our attitude is very consistent. You see exactly the same thing from the Biden administration now. Would you please just all settle down? It's time for a peace agreement. Peace agreement, peace agreement. No, peace agreement. No matter what the actual participants in this want, whether or not there's anyone who wants peace, right? It's an old American fantasy that if we can just get these people to settle down, we can concentrate on the important things.
And they'll all get along, right?
Right, and it's always in the context of a much bigger competition between the United States and then it was the Soviet Union. Now it's Russia and China. But after 1967, the United States was looking at this and thinking, wow, not only did Israel deliver a humiliating blow to a Soviet client, they came back with all these weapons that we could look at that were being used against our troops in Vietnam.
Oh, yeah.
And the intelligence that Israel was able to collect, their skill on the battlefield, this is what made Americans think, we should make this a closer relationship. That's the genesis of the special relationship between Israel and the United States. Before that, we were really trying to maintain a certain neutrality, a certain distance. But this was such a remarkable achievement that the United States and Israel became very close. And this relationship, then there's another war in 1973, which is also a very significant war. But this relationship was what allowed the United States to coax Egypt out of Soviet hands and back into the Western fold. So Kissinger wound up saying to Sadat, yes, the Soviets can give you more weapons, but only we can get you your territory back. Meanwhile, the Soviets were saying to Sadat, you want more weapons for it? So you can give those to the Israelis too? So there's
1973, was that the Yom Kippur War?
That's right. It was a surprise attack. And although Israel did in the end win, it was a huge blow to Israeli morale, confidence, their sense of they felt invincible after 67.
Right.
And after 73, there was recrimination very much like what we're seeing now. Why didn't we realize this was coming? What was wrong with the way we were looking at the picture here? The Israelis use the same word now. The conception of what the region was wrong. They thought there was no way that Egypt would launch a war because they wouldn't win it, right? And you see something similar now, or you saw something similar now. So Israel is in possession of this territory and doesn't know what to do with it. There's a growing messianic cohort that wants to settle this because it's ancient. It's Eretz Israel. It's the ancient land of Israel where, Ruth and Abraham walked the earth, and it's very, very important to them. There's another group that says, but we can't do that because if we do, we're going to end up in something that isn't a Jewish state. I mean, there's just too many Arabs here. We're not going to be the majority. Right. There is a hugely significant voice, and still very significant voice, saying we need this territory for strategic depth. We can no longer be a country that is 8 miles wide at its narrowest point.
I think that people have no idea literally how small the country, the land of Israel is. And I know you have some maps. You have one
like Rhode Island,
shows that.
Let me show you. Forgive me while I look for the maps, but let me show you.
Absolutely. But I think it's important for people to understand how small. I mean, New Mexico landmass is the 5th largest state in the Union. And it is massive compared to Israel. Israel would love to have the same amount of land that we have just here in New Mexico, let alone the United States. And so it's, you know, I also think people picture how small land-wise Israel is. And
I believe it's about the size of Rhode Island.
yeah.
It's a very, very small country. And that's not unknown. Singapore is a very small country, but it's a lot smaller than you would think, given the amount of attention people pay to it.
Yeah.
So before the 67 war, well, let me show you on the map. All right, here are the pre-67 borders. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, and so this belonged to Jordan.
Okay.
And right here, at its narrowest point, about 8 miles.
About 8 miles,
I believe. Let's see. You can actually look on the yeah, a little about that. So, how far is it across Central Park from on the crosswise?
I don't know.
I mean, we're talking about very, very small amounts of land, and obviously this was a strategic liability, to say the least. They called it the suicide borders, or the Auschwitz borders, when they're being really vulgar. And there was a substantial contingent who said, for security reasons, we can't ever let this area go. We can't ever let this area go. But there was no consensus. No one envisioned that in the year 2024, this would still be unsettled.
Right.
Now, it's at this time that you have the rise of the PLO under Yasser Arafat. And
Palestinian Liberation.
That's right. Now, I was very surprised. I saw an interview with some of the protesters at one of the universities where there's been a lot of protests. And one of the protesters was asked about Arafat and said the name was unfamiliar to him.
Oh, goodness.
Which is remarkable. Well, if people listening aren't familiar with the name, it's because they're young. But there was, when we were growing up, you and I, this was a name that was in the news a lot.
Yes, yes.
The real pioneer of modern terrorism. It was barely a week seemed to go by without the PLO hijacking an airplane or committing some kind of outrage. And
that was definitely the beginning of what we see as modern terrorism.
Absolutely.
Arafat, like you said, hijacking an airplane or blowing up a bus or, blowing up a car right next to a cafe. And those were, like you said, almost weekly briefings for us in the military.
Were they?
Yeah.
Yep. And when was this exactly? Because you were in Desert Storm, so that would have been.
I mean, we were, 80s, early 90s.
Yeah. So were you also dealing with Hezbollah?
No, mostly I was in England, so we were dealing a lot with the IRA, believe it or not, the Irish Republic.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it.
Same time, the PLO was doing everything in the Middle East, and so it was a very contentious time in the world.
Yeah, well, it was a contentious time, although I think it's a much more unsettled time now. I kind of miss the stability of the Cold War, don't you?
Yeah.
Yes. So you have Israel with this land that it is basically envisioning trading for peace. Basically thinking, as with the Egyptians, we're going to find some way to give them their land back, and in exchange we get a peace treaty. But because Egypt wanted nothing to do with Gaza, they had tried governing it before, and they knew this was an ungovernable group of people, and they didn't want it back. The Jordanians said, we don't want it back either. That's for the Palestinians. We don't want the West Bank either.
So the two who had kind of ruled it before didn't want it back, and actually even to this day, we see with the current conflict that's going on, the Palestinians aren't allowed to go into Egypt or Jordan as refugees, right? They won't let them in.
Well, this is something that gets overlooked a lot. That people are always talking about the Israeli blockade on Gaza without realizing it's equally blockaded it has been blockaded by Egypt for exactly the same reasons.
Right.
Because Hamas was intimately involved with the terrorist groups that Egypt has been fighting lethally,
Right.
very, very serious fight in the Sinai. And the Egyptians didn't want anything slipping in and out of that region any more than the Israelis did.
Well, and that gets into a whole nother history discussion of really the war in the Israeli Arab countries between each other, because there's different sects of Islam that hate each other. You get into the Shiites and the Sunnis, and that's a whole nother history discussion for another day. But I think play into some of this because Egypt doesn't want the Palestinians to come into Egypt because they're afraid they'll actually carry out terrorist acts in Egypt.
Or help their own homegrown terrorists to carry out their terrorist attacks. Now, I don't want anyone to be misled. This is not actually an example of Shiite-Sunni animosity. The Hamas is Sunni, and so are the Egyptians. But Hamas is being supported by the Iranians, who are Shia. And
okay.
The Iranians, I think, would be, they have complete contempt for Hamas. Their vision is once they take over the region, they will just kill Hamas as infidels, right? They're very, very close and intimate with Hezbollah because Hezbollah are Shia. Hamas is just a tool for them, a means to an end. What Hamas has in common with the terrorists in Egypt is the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas emerges from the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay. The Muslim Brotherhood is founded in the 1920s by Hassan al-Banna, and it is really the ideological font of all modern terrorism. Okay. This is the beginning of the idea that for all questions, Islam is the answer, and Islam must be imposed in the most rigid way possible. It's a highly anti-Western ideology, and it's also been a very successful one. Some ways because Muslim Brotherhood has been very good at creating local charities, soup kitchens, hospitals, medical care. No. And in other ways because this region is going through a convulsion that I think for most Americans is unimaginable. There's Western modernity on one side, there's complete destruction of your traditional way of life. On the other, the Ottoman Empire is gone. There's the question, what are we and what do we do with ourselves and how do we do it is really profound, And one thing that people know they are is Muslims.
Right.
So it's something they can grab onto and hold. But until this period, people knew they were Muslims, but did not really think of it as Muslims as opposed to something else. The Ottoman Empire was huge. It was universal. They didn't really have to think about how does this relate to the West?
Right.
The Ottomans thought for hundreds of years, the West was seen as kind of peripheral to the real world in the Middle East run by the Ottomans. So I think there's a massive, massive identity crisis throughout the region. What are we?
To kind of jump ahead and start wrapping up, but let's talk about Gaza and maybe we have in 2005 after the second Intifada that what happened in the Gaza Strip that kind of led us to the attack last October.
Yeah. Okay. So when people say that they want a two-state solution, they should understand that there was one. When Israel withdrew completely and unilaterally from Gaza in 2005, said, we don't care what you do. We're pulling out all our settlers. We're pulling out all our troops. Make a state if you want. We'll leave you our greenhouses. We just do not want to be dealing with this anymore. And what they got was a Hamas takeover and rockets endlessly being shot at Israeli communities. We skipped over the Oslo process, but there was a peace process in that had been initiated in the 1990s.
Yeah, you have
that
the
had its
boards.
Yeah, and during that time when Israel and the PLO were supposedly on the path to a two-state solution, the suicide bombings were almost daily.
Right.
I mean, there was a rejectionist faction among the Palestinians that was determined to scuttle the process, and which the Palestinian Authority, which was the temporary entity that had been created, a proto-state, could not control, or perhaps did not want to control.
Right.
So Israelis had, by this point, become quite despairing about the prospect of there ever being peace with the Palestinians. And when they pulled out of Gaza, the thinking was, we just want disengagement. We want nothing to do with it. They can do their own thing, whatever it is. And it turns out to be a terrorist state on their border that is incredibly repressive domestically. I mean, if anyone who is rooting for this entity to take over the rest of the region as they wish to do, should be aware that this is just repressive and barbaric beyond words.
The Palestinians, did they understand what they were getting when they voted for Hamas to come in?
Good question. They certainly understood Hamas's ideology. I mean, Hamas in its charter says that it wants the eradication of the state of Israel and the eradication of Jews around the world. I mean, it's explicitly genocidal, and an Islamic theocracy, right? A theocracy that spreads to the region but begins in this part of the world. Mm-hmm. But Hamas was, as part of the Muslim Brotherhood, was also providing a lot of social services. Right. And the Palestinian Authority was viewed as intolerably corrupt, which it was. And I think there were probably a lot of people voted for them as a protest vote. Mm-hmm. Probably a lot of people voted for them out of frustration and to give the middle finger to the Palestinian Authority. And probably a lot of people voted for them because they were 100% down with that plan, right? Mm-hmm. Eradicate the Jews, don't give an inch. And then once you're done eradicating the Jews, establish a caliphate in the region, 100% Islamist theocracy. Their election led to a civil war in which the Palestinian Authority was defeated. And then you have an entity that Israelis call Hamastan, right? You know, it's just it's a terror enclave that is functioning effectively as a statelet. All of its needs are being provided for by the UN Relief and Works Agency. So there is no indigenous, the rulers of Gaza have not tried to develop its agriculture or its desalination plants. I wrote an article and I was looking at all the donations of desalination plants that have been given to Gaza by international aid donors over the years. Right. And they're not there. I mean, they are not there to the point that the first thing that happened in the war, which was seen as evidence of Israel's genocidal ambitions, was Israel said, oh, okay, we're not going to actually give you any more of our water because we're at war with you. And there's no water in Gaza because of this. And this is not, I mean, it's just a crazy situation where none of the natural incentives that people have for governing themselves in their own interest are there. And you have these UNRWA schools teaching Palestinians this incredible hatred of Jews. And for example, in math textbooks, you've got, the way they teach arithmetic is if you kill 5 Jews, but only 3 die, how many Jews are left, right? You know, wow. It's just insane. It's just insane. And the international community has put up with this as long as it has, is dismaying, but it's not surprising because usually, unless something is actively blowing up, no one wants to deal with the problem, right?
Not only put up with, but paid for it.
Yeah, paid for.
Supported it.
Yeah, supported it. And on October 7th, the situation exploded. And in an unspeakable tragedy, not just for Israelis, but for Palestinians. What Hamas has done to the Palestinians is one of the most barbaric imaginable crimes. They knew that Israel was not going to simply say, well, okay, you got us. They knew what the result would be. They had been spending all of this aid money on an underground city of tunnels. Something that is as long as the London Underground, with tunnels through which you can drive trucks, and they've got factories under there where they're making weapons.
Sent in to build the desalination plants, to build the economy of, to take care of the people of Palestine, the Palestinian people. They were using for building up their military and building these underground tunnels. And
these tunnels are huge, and I want listeners to think about something and how stunning this is. When Russia launches airstrikes against Ukrainians, there are generally deaths, and it's horrible. It's absolutely barbaric. But you do not see headlines that say something like 200 Ukrainians killed in a Russian airstrike. Why is that? Because Ukrainians are underground. They go into the metro, they go into bomb shelters. Why, given that Palestinians in Gaza have this massive underground shelter, do we see the kind of casualties that we do whenever there's an Israeli airstrike?
I would think the only reason would be they don't let the people in those.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And the reason for that is in order to create in Israelis precisely the dilemma they face, that if they kill 200 Gazan civilians in an airstrike, first of all, it's monstrous. And second, it's going to make the entire world think of Israel as monstrous and illegitimate.
Right.
So, I mean, to be more thick, to be more, it's hard to equal that degree of depravity. It's really hard to equal that degree of depravity.
Well, it's kind of like, they store weapons in hospitals or, schools. They don't
weapons in hospitals and schools. Yeah.
Doesn't care at all about civilian casualties. It didn't bother them at all. In fact, they almost prefer it.
Yes, they do prefer it. It is the strategy, and
turn against it.
And they're open about that. They're open about that, about the Palestinian people are giving their lives to combat the Jews. But that the whole world has fallen for it is dismaying. I guess it's a lot to ask people to be aware. First, most people can't imagine that degree of depravity. And it's a lot for people to really understand, because most of what people see in the news, they see images, they see a lot of fake images of this conflict. I mean, at least half the photos that people think they're seeing from Gaza are actually from Syria. But it works. The strategy works, and it works at the expense of Gazan civilians. And it is hideous. It's absolutely hideous. And it has led to demonstrations the world around against Israel, and not unprecedented, but unprecedented in recent years epidemic of anti-Semitism. It's led to Israel being accused of war crimes and
trying to commit genocide, those types of things, So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Do you think that there's any chance of a two-state solution at this point? I mean, part of the why Gaza happened that I picked up is that you actually saw Israel getting ready to sign several peace treaties with other countries that you'd never seen before. And Hamas was like, we're not going to have any of that. It was Iran that was saying that and told Hamas to launch these attacks. They've rejected the two-state solution in the past. Don't you think they would continue to reject that?
I am looking for something that gives me a sense of how this war has affected Palestinians. I'm looking for polling data. I'm looking for voices from Palestinian territories that tell me whether anything about this catastrophic experience has made enough Palestinians say to themselves, we can't keep going through this. We want something different, that it's worth thinking about again. Okay. And I just don't know. I haven't been anywhere in the region recently. I haven't spoken to anyone on the ground recently. don't really trust a lot of the reporting I get from the region.
Yeah.
I'd like to know whether this experience has created a large enough critical mass of Palestinians who are willing to say, we can't keep going through this. We cannot keep doing this. We need to have a state of our own. We need to live in peace with Israel. You only need, I think you need, what percentage of the population has to feel that way? Enough to control the crazies, right? So if 80% feels that way, then you can make a go of it. But you can't make a go of it unless it's a solid majority, because then you just end up, as you have in the past, with civil war, and the crazier people tend to win, right? Because they are just more motivated, more violent.
So do you think there's any answer for lasting peace in the region?
Yeah, I think it would help a lot if the regime in Iran came to an end. That would definitely help. Iran is funding these groups, it's funding Hezbollah, it's funding the Houthis, it's funding Hamas. It wouldn't solve the problem, but it would take the money out of the problem, which always...
Right, you don't have weapons, or at least modern ones, without money.
Right. And I think that continuing with the Abraham Accords and extending them to the Saudis would make a huge difference. It would suggest the world is moving on. We're not going to look at this the way we did in the 20th century anymore.
Right.
Getting a completely new educational system in Gaza and the West Bank would make a big difference. And you can't expect people who've been educated on this diet of drunken, ravening insanity to be thinking, it's a little much to suddenly say, okay, now we want you to have a state, govern it.
Yeah. And it's almost, I think, a brainwashing is what they've gotten, not an education, to
absolutely,
of hatred. That is just something we just can't imagine as Americans, and your experience of living all over the world may have helped you understand it a little bit better. But I really appreciate, and we've gone over an hour, so
sorry.
Easy to do. No, I think it's been great. Maybe at some other time we can pick up again and talk more. But this has been really a learning process for me, and I really appreciate you joining us. And I hope that our listeners will understand the region a little bit better. We're not going to be able to teach you everything about the region in an hour, obviously, and we're going to put your information in there about how they can get a hold of you and take that class, because I think that'd be a great thing for all of us to do. I'm looking forward to getting involved.
I warmly invite all of our listeners, and I'm well aware there's going to be people who say, but you're simplifying it. Yes, I know. So it's a little hard to...
You have to be able to cover it in an hour. So, and we didn't even cover it in an hour. There's just so much history here that you really would have to take a class on it to truly understand everything that's gone on with Israel. I just want everyone to be to understand, as Americans, we have lived in this bubble of peace that really, I'm not sure anyone else in the world has had. Maybe Canada, our neighbors to the north, they haven't been involved in a lot of conflicts.
Switzerland,
but we've not had, like, even terrorist attacks. We really haven't had. So I think it's really important for people to understand that this is just a totally different perspective that I don't think can really understand. We can try to, but I don't think we really can. And Israel has been our greatest ally and our strongest ally as Americans. And when we were attacked on 9/11, Israel stood with us. And it's one of the reasons that I fully and completely stand with Israel and their right to defend themselves the way that they see fit and the way that they know, because we don't know. In fact, I don't even think our politicians understand what's really happening in Israel. So thank you again so much. And we will have your information so people can contact you. And I'm looking forward to getting on your and listening to some of your stuff on the Cosmopolitan Globalist. So
thank you so much for inviting me. I enjoyed that conversation very much, and I'm already thinking of all the things that I'd like to tell listeners that I couldn't figure out how to include, but I hope they'll come and join us, and we can fill in the gaps.
Well, that'll be awesome. Thank you so much, Claire. Great to meet you.
Yeah.